We've heard about the founding fathers, but what about the founding mothers? As we celebrate Mother's Day, it's the perfect time to stop and reflect on the contributions women have made to societal, cultural, educational, and political institutions. And as America celebrates its 250th anniversary, it's important to look at how their many efforts were often overlooked by history. Women were vital in colonial America, and from its earliest foundations, a social class structure emerged, and expectations were evident and defined. But a new nation with room for opportunity meant new opportunities for women as well. While the beat of progress was slow and quiet, women were taking steps toward independence within their roles at home as well as the public space. Their involvement in the politics of the revolution, boycotting, petitioning, even publishing patriot literature, was a path into what was historically men's spheres. Catherine Pittman is a historian at the research department at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. She says society was divided into a pyramid with roles defined at each level.
During the Revolutionary War, you see women engaging in men's spheres, or what were traditionally men's spheres, in a renewed sense. You have women managing estates and businesses and trade, stepping into their husbands, brothers, sons, fathers. You also see women following the army.
The onset of the war held equally seismic changes for indigenous women. Many women in nearby tribes held large political and social capital in their communities. They served in roles as diplomats, tribe leaders, wartime strategists, and they were the ones to pass down the knowledge of many cultural traditions. As the war brought increased contact between colonists and tribes, it had the cascading effect of subsuming white cultural norms into indigenous social structures. This could lead to decreased prominence in political and social decision-making for indigenous women. Despite the potential for assimilation and the future implications, indigenous women made the decision to get involved in the war efforts on both sides. Social change is the reverberation of war. Emancipation in the Civil War, women's suffrage in World War I, civil rights and the Vietnam War. The Revolutionary War allowed women the agency to fill roles typically slotted for men. In colonial times, while men were away or died, women often managed farms and businesses. Jane Vobe, who owned a tavern in Williamsburg, was a woman who, when either abandoned or widowed, records aren't sure, stepped forward to create a life for herself. Vobe kept the King's Arms Tavern on Duke of Gloucester Street for over 30 years. It became a key political and social gathering spot, and many of the leading Virginians, synonymous with the American Revolution, Washington, Jefferson, and others, patronized it. Sharon Hollins with Colonial Williamsburg portrays Jane Vobe. She says Vobe is an example of women whose tenacity is often glossed over in American history books or completely overlooked.
First of all, I think she illustrates something that we don't really think about. I don't know that we necessarily think about women succeeding and having businesses and so forth in this time period. Build a business that becomes one of the most prominent taverns in Williamsburg. It's one of two taverns that we know of that survived the war. And she does this, how does she do this? I mean, yes, she's probably got some help, but she's got to have some know-how too. And I don't know that that's something that we can think about. And I can't tell you, it's very interesting. I can't tell you the number of times when I've gone out and done a public audience and I talk about, everything that I've been through, that Mrs. Vobe has been through. And somebody will come up to me afterwards and say, my great-grandmother arrived here with her husband from Ireland in, 1902. And shortly after they got here, her husband died or he left or what have you, and she had to manage on her own. And that's what she did. She opened up her home as a boarding house or, that sort of thing. And so I think it's something that we see throughout history, but it also kind of shows people's resiliency when the chips are down, and I think that it's just really something that we don't think about.
As a part of Revolution 250, WHRO looks at the impactful contributions of women in colonial America, shedding light on their resilience and dedication to shaping a society that would one day strive for greater equality.
Taverns were often the epicenter of where debate and conversation about thoughts of independence could be heard. Some even served as post office and courthouses, and they were where business was conducted. Taverns of the period also served as gendered spaces where women could engage in public life, challenging tradition. Like Jane Vobe, Polly Miller ran an ordinary in Great Bridge, where an early battle helped shape the direction of Patriot resistance. Great Bridge was a thriving merchant village in today's Chesapeake. Just steps from the vital crossing over the southern branch of the Elizabeth River stood two such establishments, the 3 Ton Tavern and Polly Miller's Ordinary. On December 9, 1775, the Battle of Great Bridge erupted nearby. Patriot forces under Colonel William Woodford routed the British in under an hour, securing a critical victory early in the war. When the smoke cleared, Polly Miller stepped forward. Known in local lore for her hospitality, she turned her ordinary into a field hospital. She cared for wounded patriots and, with equal compassion, tended injured British soldiers. Historian William Forrest credits her with saving at least 6 lives. Alongside the 3 Ton Tavern, Polly's Ordinary anchored a community of middling-class merchants, people not wealthy enough to wield political power, but prosperous enough to shape events. Their town, well connected by land and river, became a hub of wartime logistics, conversation, and care. In the American Revolution, even taverns became battlegrounds of service, and women like Polly Miller made sure no one was left behind.
Women trained girls to be wives and mothers. They helped with cooking and preserving food. During the Revolutionary era, the work was difficult and often exhausting. They maintained households and, when necessary, helped in their husbands' businesses and farm management. The wealthy had servants and enslaved individuals to help. Rights for women were very basic and few. Girls could not go to college, but among the wealthy and elite, young women were often tutored and educated in reading. Sharon Hollins with Colonial Williamsburg says it was class structure and marital status that dictated a woman's place in society.
It's generally considered that a woman's sphere is the household and the man's sphere is the public sphere. So most of the woman's responsibility in the case of a married woman, or what was known legally as a femme covert, would be the household, the raising of the children, the managing of the enslaved that reported to the household. Now, obviously, this is also a little bit where wealth and social station play in, because a poorer woman who maybe doesn't have any enslaved individuals or has fewer enslaved individuals is going to be doing a lot more of the day-to-day, might think of it as housework or the day-to-day workings of the house. Whereas a more affluent woman, whether she actually be gentry or just be a wealthy middle class, middling sort woman, is going to be more managing than actually doing the work. But the raising of children, the management of the household and all of that, that's what falls to the women. Now, when you've got what's known as a femme sole, an unmarried woman, whether she has never married, whether she's a widow, whether her husband has abandoned her, then, of course, you might find her tending to business aspects as well. A femme covert does not represent herself in court. She is represented by her husband's interests. But a femme sole, that unmarried or that widowed woman or what have you, she would be representing herself in court if need be. She'd be tending to all the business affairs. It really depends on what needs to be done.
And as revolutionary feeling began to emerge, women too began to weigh in on the debate. Abigail Adams wrote to her husband John while he was in Philadelphia debating independence, reminding him to think about women and their rights.
I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation.
Kelly Brennan, a historian with Colonial Williamsburg, says it was during the Revolutionary era that women saw a shift in attitude and their place in society.
As we move through the 18th century and we get to the Enlightenment, we start seeing sort of an uptick in women's education. There's a recognition that women are people. This is a gradual thing, but really important at the time of the Revolution. The thing is, when we talk about women and we think the women in the Revolution, we think that they're like 19th century women, and they're not. The expectations of them are different in the colonial period, and the way that they sort of conduct their lives is different as well.
Many women began traveling with the Army and providing services to the troops like laundry and nursing. Catherine Pittman says there was a clear social distinction within these camp followers. While many had no other option, depending on the Army to protect and feed them, there also were officer wives who entertained dignitaries and other officials.
There were two different types of women that followed the Army. One were the camp followers, and these are women oftentimes that had nowhere else to go. They were the wives, sisters, daughters of the soldiers, and they had no financial recourse, and so they followed along with the Army. And then the other group of women that you often saw in and amongst the soldiery were ladies. And there was a social distinction between a woman and a lady, and these ladies were officers' wives, and they would attend these winter encampments. They had a political role in that environment. It wasn't just following their husband and attending parties. During those winter encampments, local dignitaries, foreign dignitaries would attend, and there would almost be like a little congress going on wherein the fate of the war, the financial fate of the war would be decided. And you see women managing those spheres. In addition to that, you see women taking a more outward political stance during the war. We have examples of women who began to be political activists as far as their writing. You see women gathering together to form associations or groups of women to gather funds for armies, most notably the Ladies' Association of 1780. So you see women stepping up where they see that there needs to be help.
And for those who remained at home, women organized boycotts. They spun yarn and wove cloth to create textiles and clothing, thus avoiding the purchase of British imports. Women also refused to buy or consume British tea. Kelly Brennan says women aimed their resistance at wealthy British merchant pocketbooks.
One of the big things is the non-importation agreement in 1774, and there is an image of Williamsburg, and it was printed all over British North America, of the women, men and women, signing this association, with the women looking on, making sure it's very important that the men sign the paperwork that says, no, we are not going to import anything from England. So part of it for them is this tower of the purse that they use.
Colonial-era women's staunch support of revolutionary attitudes shifted roles and responsibilities for many. Daily chores changed when British goods were boycotted, as items now had to be handmade. Everyday items, candles, soap, and cloth had to be domestically produced instead of being purchased. Enslaved women had to learn new tasks like weaving. The economic protests gave women a political voice and a new emerging role in a nation that, too, was evolving and budding with fresh ideals.
Colonial women were steadfast in their support of independence, and one vital mechanism to show their determination was through the power of the purse. Prior to the outbreak of hostilities with Britain, colonial women were politically active, signing on to boycotts of British goods. Groups like the Daughters of Liberty, the female counterpart to the Sons of Liberty, organized as early as the 1760s, fighting back against the Stamp Act. Pamphlets were published encouraging women to continue boycotting British goods, and the group was at the forefront of the non-consumption movement, a political call boycotting imported British goods. In January 1770, the Boston Evening Post listed 300 women who had pledged to boycott British goods. Samuel Adams, recognizing their efforts, once stated,
"With ladies on our side, we can make every Tory tremble."
As talk of the revolution began to simmer, women in Edenton, North Carolina staged one of the first political actions. 51 women gathered at the home of Elizabeth King on April 25, 1774, to sip tea made from herbs and sign a resolution to boycott British imports, saying they were, quote, determined to give a memorable proof of their patriotism.
We cannot be indifferent in any occasion that appears nearly to affect the peace and happiness of our country.
The Edenton Compact not only hurt the British economy, but also served notice. America could sustain itself, and women were beginning to show their empowerment in the struggle for independence. If women could forego British tea, they could likewise challenge British textile markets. By boycotting imported silks and cloth, women organized spinning bees, producing their own fabric and clothing. They also targeted merchants who remained loyal to Britain. One such individual, William Jackson, paid the price for his allegiance. Jackson, the owner of a general goods store, was a staunch defender of the crown and continued to import British goods in open defiance of a female-led boycott. In response, women gathered outside his store to discourage potential customers. Handbills and public notices were distributed throughout the city, identifying Jackson and others who continued to support British trade. Effigies representing these importers were displayed outside their shops. Women remained resolute in their boycott. Ultimately, Jackson and others who refused to heed colonial demands fled the city. Women who often were responsible for running colonial households made political statements with their boycotts during the American Revolution. Though women's rights were limited, they couldn't serve in Congress or the military and could not vote, they did emerge as participants in shaping a new nation. They organized not only regionally, but across the 13 colonies, using their domestic purchasing power to hurt the mechanisms of British rule, using the power of the purse to make lasting change.
Women of the period soon furthered their convictions to challenge the standard norms that saw their legal and political rights tightly curtailed. Not only were they stepping forward physically, running farms and businesses, or closely following their soldier husbands and helping with cooking and nursing, they also found ways to challenge limiting legal precedents that held them back. In the 18th century, the legal doctrine of coverture placed married women under the authority of their husbands. They could not vote, hold office, or own property independently in most colonies. And yet, in what is now Cape Charles, Virginia, Anne Neach Aird Mifflin Roberts inherited the Golden Quarter plantation from her father, a rare case of a woman holding land in her own name. Anne and her husband Humphrey Roberts lived primarily in Portsmouth, but in 1764 they sold part of Golden Quarter while retaining other parcels. When the Revolution erupted, Humphrey, a loyalist, fled Britain. Anne is believed to have left Portsmouth then, returning to Golden Quarter to manage her property. Influenced by her cousin, Quaker abolitionist Warner Mifflin, Anne sought to free the people she enslaved, or at least pledged to do so. When Humphrey returned after the war, he demanded their return, claiming that under coverture she lacked the legal authority to free them. This dispute led to the 1794 case Tom v. Roberts, heard by Judge Henry St. George Tucker Sr. It tested not only women's rights under coverture, but also property claims, confiscation law, and the reach of judicial power in post-revolutionary America. The case set a precedent that would challenge the restrictive legal framework surrounding women's autonomy and property rights.
While many women stayed put during the Revolutionary War, raising money, boycotting, sewing uniforms, running businesses, handling households, and raising families, other women followed the armies as camp followers, taking on the domestic care of the camp and the soldiers as cooks, laundresses, and nurses. But there are a few incredible cases of some women who disguised themselves as men and fought on the battlefield. Anna Maria Lane is the only recorded woman in Virginia who took up arms, dressed in soldier's garb, and followed her husband onto the battlefield. It's believed that Lane was born in New England, but ended up in Virginia with her husband John after their service. Her husband, John Lane, joined the Connecticut Continental Army in 1776 and originally served under General Israel Putnam. It's likely that Anna came along originally as a camp follower, but during some time in their campaigns across New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, Anna decided that she would pick up a rifle, put on a uniform, and fight alongside her husband. Before this, George Washington issued an edict that no camp follower was allowed on the battlefield, but it is said that at the time, physicals were uncommon, and as long as you could pack and shoot a rifle, you passed the enlistment requirements. It was probably fairly easy for Anna to fly under the radar, as men seldom washed and normally slept in their uniforms. On October 3, 1777, Anna and John participated in the Battle of Germantown in Pennsylvania under General George Washington. This is where she suffered a leg injury that left her permanently disabled. It's thought that she refused medical treatment in fear of being found out, but that battle and injury still didn't dissuade her from continuing her service with her husband when he re-enlisted in the Virginia Light Dragoons. She was with him when he was severely wounded in the Siege of Savannah in 1779. They both served until 1781 and settled down in Richmond, where they lived in the Public Guard barracks. John worked protecting public property as a part of the Guard, and Anna worked as a nurse in the military hospital. In 1808, Governor William H. Cable asked the General Assembly to award pensions to many disabled soldiers, including the Lanes and a few other women who served as camp followers. Cable specifically mentioned Anna, citing her heroic deeds and the injury she sustained in battle. The men's pension at the time was $40 per year. Anna's pension, citing her extraordinary military service, was $100 a year, which today would be $2,600. She died 2 years later in July 1810, around the age of 55. Anna Maria Lane might be the only recorded female soldier tied to Virginia, but there are records across the colonies. Ann Bailey, Margaret Corbin, Mary Ludwig Hayes, Deborah Sampson, Sally St. Clair, and Prudence Wright. As far as women Revolutionary soldiers go, the name Molly Pitcher is probably the most well-known, and her exact identity is up for debate, but it's likely that she's an amalgamation of these real women who chose to fight for their new nation in a very real and dangerous way, hidden on the front lines.
What would you have been if you'd not married the widow Custis? Said an agitated veteran of the Revolutionary War to then-President George Washington. Martha Dandridge was born on June 2, 1731 on a plantation near Williamsburg. She enjoyed riding horses, gardening, sewing, playing the spinet, and dancing. Her father saw that she received a fair education in basic mathematics, reading, and writing, something girls primarily did not receive at the time. Catherine Pittman, who portrays Martha Washington at Colonial Williamsburg, says that Washington's upbringing was fairly normal.
If you look at just the woman and her life experience, she was a very normal, ordinary woman for her time period. She was born 30 miles from Williamsburg in New Kent County on the banks of the Pamunkey River to a very ordinary family. Her father, John Dandridge, was the legal clerk of New Kent County. She was the oldest of 8 children born to her parents. And she had a very typical upbringing. There was nothing extraordinary about it.
In 1750, Martha married wealthy planter Daniel Parke Custis, who died 7 years later, leaving her as one of the wealthiest women in colonial America. She would remarry to George Washington, which would elevate her eventually as the founding First Lady of the United States. Having been widowed early and after her marriage to George Washington, due to his frequent absences, she became accustomed to managing a vast estate that included over 300 enslaved individuals. As war with Britain broke out, and with her husband heading the Continental Army, Martha Washington was propelled to the forefront of revolutionary activity. Catherine Pittman says the couple were aware that their lives were about to forever change.
They had a pretty normal marriage for about 16 years. They got married in 1759, but all of that would change in 1775 when the Continental Congress appointed Washington as commander-in-chief of the Continental Forces. Washington even knows in that moment that it is going to change his and her life forever. He writes to her one of the only surviving letters that we have between them, and it's a very iconic letter, and it's wonderful that we still have it, upon his commission as commanding officer. And he notes in the letter that he recognizes that this is going to affect their lives, and it sure did. From that moment, their lives would never be the same. And she stepped into a very public role during the American Revolution.
The Washingtons were not immediate members of the colonial power elite. Rumors widely circulated that she was a loyalist. However, Martha stood firm in her support of her husband, first as an army wife. In a time when long-distance travel was difficult and dangerous, Martha journeyed to encampments at Cambridge, Valley Forge, Philadelphia, and Morristown to support her husband and soldiers in disease-ridden encampments. She entertained officials and rallied around other officer wives to sew clothing for soldiers. She was known to do clerical work for her husband and to confer with him over military strategy. Martha Washington set an early precedent for women in the public eye. Pittman says the couple knew they were being watched, and Martha took steps to convey that she was firm in her support of the revolution, eventually becoming an asset in gaining public support.
The country grew to love her. They gave her a nickname or a title, Lady Washington, and that fame grew, and she even understood the value of that fame, and she began to utilize that celebrity to affect how people viewed the American womanhood during that time. She became the figurehead of the 1780 Ladies Association. She was known to only wear homespun in an attempt to promote that American frugality. So it was all seemingly calculated, but in a way that she and Washington understood the assignment, for lack of a better phrase, that they understood that they were being watched, and they understood that their actions could dictate how the rest of the country would then comport themselves.
Undoubtedly, the presence of Martha Washington at the war front had a tremendous impact on the morale of the Continental Army. From a calming presence as wife to the general, to banding with other officer wives and making clothing, she also entertained foreign officials and top-ranking politicians, setting the stage as First Lady of the Continental Army and soon of the nation.
Martha Washington wasn't the only woman in the camps. Other women, some through necessity, followed their husbands during military service. They became an indispensable support service, cooking, washing, and mending uniforms. In sickness, they nursed soldiers and also carried supplies, luggage, and needed camp materials with them. One, Sarah Osborne Benjamin, proved that these women served a role in revolutionary efforts that were both vital and courageous. Born in 1743 in Goshen, New York, Sarah Osborne Benjamin followed her husband Aaron into the camps of the Continental Army. While he served in the commissary guard, she washed, mended, and cooked for the troops, spending harsh winters in encampments at West Point and Newburgh. In 1781, during the siege of Yorktown, Sarah carried food through trenches under fire. As she passed soldiers, General George Washington asked if she feared the cannonballs. No, she replied. It would not be fair for the men to fight and also go hungry. Later, she described riding horseback through the war-torn streets of Philadelphia, baking bread near burned-out houses and settling in behind American lines to cook and care for weary soldiers. She remembered the thunder of artillery echoing through fog as American forces closed in on victory. We know her story because she told it, applying for a war pension decades later and detailing every footstep, every fire, and every act of service she gave alongside the army she supported. Sarah lived past the age of 100, long enough to see the republic she helped nurture take firm root. Her life reminds us that the revolution was not only fought by men with muskets, but also by women with grit, determination, and galloping courage.
Martha Washington is one of those unassuming characters which creates love and esteem.
Those words, written by Abigail Adams, perfectly capture the essence of the woman who would become a national symbol of resilience. Known affectionately as Lady Washington, Martha had emerged from the Revolutionary War as much more than a general's wife. She had camped at the front lines, rallied weary troops, and led officer wives in service. Even when away from the battlefield, her focus never wavered, ensuring the Mount Vernon estate remained a stable foundation for her husband's return. Martha's dedication was tireless, as one visitor to Valley Forge in 1778 noted.
I never in my life knew a woman so busy from early morning until latest as was Lady Washington.
Beyond nursing the sick and cheering troops whose prospects looked increasingly bleak, she acted as a vital liaison between the general and the political world. At war's end, Martha returned to Mount Vernon alongside George, perhaps longing for the tranquility of the Potomac. However, duty would soon call them back to the center of a struggling new nation, as the quiet life they envisioned was once again traded for the weight of leadership. Post-war colonial America had no unified national government. The only framework, the Articles of Confederation, created a loose league of friendship with few powers belonging to the national government. Almost immediately, trade disputes emerged between states. By 1787, delegates were assembling in Philadelphia in an attempt to address the dysfunction, and at the helm was George Washington. The conclusion of this meeting was a complete rewrite of the way the nation would be governed, a new constitutional government. Once again, Washington was called upon to serve, with Martha by his side as the nation's first First Lady. In 1789, after being informed that George was to become the first president, Martha confided to her brother.
It is much too late to go into public life again, but it is not to be avoided.
Once again, Martha would find herself at the epicenter of a shifting government dynamic. Martha Washington had no precedents to follow as First Lady. She was the first, and she realized that she would establish the examples that others would follow. She was known for her hospitality and grace, holding weekly receptions and formal dinners that became integral to the social and political life of the new nation. Despite finding the role personally challenging and often expressing a sense of loneliness, she viewed it as her duty to support her husband and the country.
Martha Washington stands out in history for her role as First Lady and the efforts she made during the Revolutionary War. And while she might have been lonely in her role, she did have contemporaries to lean on, other Virginian women supporting her. Much is unknown about Martha Jefferson. No portraits exist, and less than a handful of letters in her hand have been preserved. We do know that she was born in 1748 to the Wales family in Charles City, Virginia, and married Thomas Jefferson in 1772, 6 months after the death of her son John from her previous marriage. Martha grew up well acquainted with the life and duties of the lady of the house. By the time she was 13, she was the hostess during social events held by her father. Her marriage to Jefferson came with a dowry of Elk Hill Plantation from her previous husband and several enslaved individuals who would later make the completion of Monticello possible. During her time as First Lady of Virginia during the Revolutionary War, she led successful campaigns. In 1780, at the appeal of Martha Washington, she raised funds and collected clothing for soldiers. She organized the drive with the help of Eleanor Madison and published the call in the Virginia Gazette, leading to its immense success. While taking care of children and households in 1781, she and her children had to evade British capture twice, once from their home in the capital and once from their home in Monticello. She never saw her husband's life as president. She passed a few months after the birth of their daughter Lucy in 1782, 19 years before he would become the third president, but she left a lasting impact on her husband and children. She's buried alongside her family at Monticello. Eleanor Madison was the mother of founding father James Madison, as well as Lieutenant General William Madison. Born in 1731 in Port Conway, Virginia, to the Conways, she grew up on a tobacco plantation. She married James Madison Sr. in 1749 and handled the education of their children and much of the household management, as well as being a caregiver to her family members outside of the home. Historians say she was one of the strongest influences in James's life and spearheaded much of the preservation of the family estate Montpelier. During the Revolution, her husband served as a colonel, and she served in the Ladies' Association alongside Martha Jefferson and other women across the colonies who raised money and supplies for soldiers. She was said to be well-versed on public affairs and current events. This may have been part of the reason she had such a strong pull with her eldest son, James, who went on to found, lead, and shape America as a new nation. It's recorded that he inherited his interest in religious liberty from her teachings. She died in 1829, more than a decade after her son finished his 2 terms as president, brought the country through the War of 1812, and continued his legacy, which started with her. She and her family are buried in the Madison Family Cemetery at Montpelier. Dorothea Henry came from a family rich in esteem as well as in history on both the Patriot and British sides. Her paternal grandfather was a British Navy commander. Her maternal grandfather served as the lieutenant governor and acting governor of the colony of Virginia. In 1777, at just 20 years old, she ended up marrying the first official governor of Virginia, Patrick Henry, making her the inaugural First Lady of Virginia, to match her cousin, Martha Washington, who was the inaugural First Lady of the country. With her family history and prominence in Virginia, historians believe her marriage to Henry helped to solidify his support across the Commonwealth. During the Revolution, she was among those who helped raise funds and supplies for the militia alongside Martha Jefferson, Eleanor Madison, and others. Through her life, she bore 11 children by Henry, 9 of whom lived to adulthood. Although with the 6 children from his previous marriage, she raised a total of 17 children at their Red Hill estate. She managed several households and plantations and returned to her role as the 6th First Lady of Virginia when Henry went back to the governorship in 1784, this time in Richmond. Dorothea died at her daughter's home in Halifax County in 1831. She was buried there before she was moved to Red Hill Plantation next to Patrick Henry.
Your pint stove, and surely I'll be mine, and we'll tack a cup of kindness yet for auld lang syne.
From field to field the savage monsters run, yet Britannia had her work begun.
Phyllis Wheatley has appropriately been called the mother of African American literature, but realistically, she should be described as the poet laureate of the American Revolution. She was among a handful of colonial women wielding a pen against the British crown. However, she was the only one who was enslaved. In 1761, Wheatley was 7 years old and arrived alone on a slave ship. She was purchased by John and Susanna Wheatley and raised and educated in their Boston home. Speaking no English, within 16 months she was fluent, and by age 11, she was composing poems that were admired around Boston. With revolutionary zeal swirling around her in the city, Wheatley would become proficient in the ideals of the American independence. In 1768, Wheatley wrote an allegorical poem simply titled America, in which Britannia is in conflict with her son Americus.
A certain lady had an only son. He grew up daily, virtuous as he grew, fearing his strength, which she undoubted knew. She laid some taxes on her darling son, and would have laid another act thereon.
Wheatley's poetry was more than just verse and prose. To the British, it was treason, punishable by death or by as an enslaved person, perhaps being taken and sold again into slavery in the Caribbean. Though the threat of harm did not quell her pen. In 1770, the Boston Massacre moved Wheatley to write a poem to protest the loss of American life, including Crispus Attucks, the first person of color to die in the fight against the British Crown. She titled the poem On the Affray in King Street on the evening of the 5th of March.
Long as in freedom's cause the wise contend, dear to you unity shall fame extend. While to the world the lettered stone shall tell how Caldwell, Attucks, Gray, and Maverick fell.
In October 1775, she wrote General George Washington a poem that, while full of praise, is also a strong political statement and recruitment pitch to join the colonial army.
In bright array they seek the work of war, where height unfurled the ensign waves in air. Shall I to Washington their praise recite? Enough thou knowest them in the fields of fight.
Washington published Wheatley's poem in the Virginia Gazette, which served as a response to the proclamation by Lord Dunmore encouraging the enslaved to flee their captors and take up arms against the colonials. The publication was meant to send a signal. Here was a formerly enslaved woman lauding the efforts against the British. Wheatley was an early advocate, a one-woman PR machine lauding a fight against the British, one voice against British rule in colonial America.
Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side. Thy every action let the goddess guide. A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine. With gold unfailing, Washington be thine.
Phyllis Wheatley was but one female voice and effort that was shaping the destiny of colonial America in advocating for independence, and these voices were being heard through print. One Virginian, Clementina Rhine, was a primary reason why such expressions were being heard. In 1773, Rhine took her husband's press and gave rise to distribution of revolutionary ideals. Born around 1740, little is known of Clementina's early years, but her life took a decisive turn in the 1760s when she married William Rhine, a Maryland printer. Together they moved to Williamsburg, where William founded a press and began publishing the Virginia Gazette, a paper that soon would become a vital forum for public debate in the colony. When William died in 1773, Clementina, just 33 and with 5 children, faced the collapse of both family and livelihood. At a time when women were denied political rights and rarely owned businesses, she made the decision to carry on. Petitioning the House of Burgesses, she pledged to continue her husband's work, becoming one of the first women in America to serve as a public printer. Under her leadership, the Virginia Gazette reflected the region's growing revolutionary spirit. In 1774, her press published Thomas Jefferson's A Summary View of the Rights of British America, a bold challenge to the Parliament that circulated widely throughout the colonies. She died later that year, but her influence lasted. Clementina Rhine helped establish the foundations of a free press in America. She demonstrated that women, even in an age that denied them power, could master the same work as men. And by daring to print voices of resistance, she gave the revolution one of its strongest weapons, the power of ideas.
America stands armed with resolution and virtue, but she still recoils at the idea of drawing the sword against the nation from whence she derived her origin. Yet Britain, like an unnatural parent, is ready to plunge her dagger into the bosom of her affectionate offspring.
Author Mercy Otis Warren had forged close relationships with many political leaders, including Patrick Henry and Samuel Adams, men who would later emerge as founding fathers. In 1772, her play The Adulterer was directed by Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson, a fierce British loyalist. She rallied others to the patriot cause with her writings, and George Washington himself was an admirer of her work. Warren was but one female voice in support of American independence as war raged across the colonies. Women, both prominent and unknown, were helping to rally the cause of American independence. Who were the leading female activists in the colonial era? Whose voices today, 250 years later, still resonate with the enduring support for revolution and unwavering patriotism? They range from the well-known, the wives of military and political leaders such as Martha Washington, Abigail Adams, and Lucy Knox, to the almost unknown and those who argued for the American cause. We have, for example, Abigail Adams, whom we heard earlier, urging her husband to, quote, remember the ladies. But there were also others of whom we have record, such as Esther Reed. Though born into the British aristocracy, Reed devoted herself entirely to the colonial cause. While her husband served as an American general, she took her own stand by publishing Sentiments of an American Woman. In this bold call to action, she spoke for the women of the Revolution, declaring that,
animated by the purest patriotism, they are sensible of sorrow at this day, in not offering more than barren wishes for the success of so glorious a revolution. They aspire to render themselves more really useful, and this sentiment is universal from the north to the south of the 13 United States.
To demonstrate her devotion to the cause of American liberty, Reed organized a group of Philadelphia women who went door to door to collect money for the Army. They raised the extraordinary sum of $300,000, which today is approximately $7 to $8 million. Then there was the subtle poetry of Hannah Griffiths, a Quaker who was wary of wartime violence, yet still she pushed men to reject the abuses of royal authority, warning that women would reject it.
Since the men from a party on fear of a frown are kept by a sugar plum quietly down, supinely asleep and deprived of their sight, are stripped of their freedom and robbed of the right. If the sons, so degenerate, the blessing despise, let the daughters of liberty nobly arise.
Colonial women fanned the revolutionary flames with pen and paper, helping to shift public opinion in favor of the Patriots. They were a pivotal force, running farms and businesses, organizing boycotts of British goods, and also using the power of words to rally the public.
Today, 250 years after a war of independence shaped a new nation, we are aware of the fears and aspirations the framers held. History tends to remember the military battles, Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, Saratoga, Yorktown, or vivid moments like the signing of the Declaration of Independence and Washington crossing the Delaware on frigid Christmas night. Though what was day-to-day life in the colonies like during the time period? Women's writings of the period give us that direct window, the successes, the failures, and how colonists struggled with fear, loss, and change. The letters of Betsy Ambler Carrington showcases how Virginians dealt with the hardships of war. Born in Yorktown in 1765, Betsy's childhood was upended when her family left their mansion and resettled in a modest home in Richmond. There, in letters to her friend Mildred Smith, she captured the disorienting rhythm of wartime life. Neighbors abandoning their homes, churches standing silent behind boarded doors, towns turned into garrisons, and the absence of fathers, brothers, and husbands away at war. Her letters were not only about her own family. She wrote of friends scarred by the conflict, like Rachel Warrington, seduced and abandoned by a French officer left with an illegitimate child. Stories like this convinced Betsy that women needed more than refinement. They needed education to face the dangers of the world. That conviction shaped her later work. Although she belonged to Virginia's elite and had the rare advantage of being educated by her father, she knew most women lacked such opportunities and understood how fragile women's positions were. That keen insight drove her to co-found Richmond's Female Humane Association, giving vulnerable girls shelter, skills, and a chance at independence. This association evolved into the Memorial Foundation for Children, which remains active today. Betsy Ambler Carrington's letters remind us that the Revolution was not only a fight for liberty, it was also a daily struggle in homes where women discovered both their burdens and their voices.
They were the founding mothers, the women who shaped a nation, emerging from the cloud of a male-dominated society that had limited their rights and responsibilities, and when the need arose for their greater participation in a struggle for independence, they responded, running farms and businesses. They published the ideals of why the course of separation from British control was needed. They organized boycotts and followed their husbands into battle, challenging the existing legal precedents of the time. Kathleen Helier, senior historian in the Department of Historical Research at Colonial Williamsburg, says it was the Revolutionary War that provided an early opportunity in American history for women to break out of traditional roles that held them back.
Women have always had to do this, and especially in the kinds of wars that are somewhat all-encompassing, like the Second World War and the Revolutionary War. Yes, women are having to take over for the men who are gone. There were many women who just had to, kind of keep going.
But, also there were chances for them to support their families. For example, when we look at the public store account, there was one in Williamsburg. So kind of like a military supply depot, if you will, for things like uniforms and, various other things. There are women just making shirts, tons of shirts. And, they're supporting themselves and their families in that way, whether their, husbands are here or not.
Colonial women were the original Rosie the Riveters, the famed World War II icons who took up traditional male occupations and roles, providing the necessary workforce for the nation to succeed during wartime. Hillier says, without the support of women, the American Revolution might have failed.
I think if women had not supported this cause, and believe me, not every woman did. There were women who were loyalists. They left or they stayed and they didn't support it. But I think the support of women was important in supplying the army, in supporting their men who were either acting in political roles or who were in the army or who were supplying the army, as tradesmen. Yes, I think it would have gone a different way.
Though often overlooked, women made vital contributions to the war effort, offering their voices and physical stamina to a nation that was struggling to find its identity. As we look back on 250 years of independence, it was the known and celebrated and also the anonymous women who showcased bravery and strength that we continue to admire today.
Thanks for joining us for this WHRO public media production of the Founding Mothers for Revolution 250, Stories from the First Shore. This program was produced by Barry Graham, Connor Worley, and Jordan Christie, with special help from Chuck Dowd, Aurora Montserrat, Kelsey Backey, Christy Walsh, Lisa Godley, and Michelle Hankerson. Hear more at whro.org/USA250.
It was down in my Sally's garden upon an ivy bush at morning and at twilight there sings a sweet song thrush. His notes come